Hello, welcome to the second week's review for the Agincourt Myth and Reality MOOC. So we've covered lots and lots of topics this week, and thank you all again very much for your input in engaging with the content that we've looked at this week. So we've looked at sort of the immediate lead up to the siege of Harfleur, the march then through Normandy up towards Calais, and then of course the battle at Agincourt, about 30 miles or so south of Calais. We've looked at the preparations for the battle itself, and the immediate aftermath. And like last week, I'll go through a few questions in this summary video. So let's start then at the siege of Harfleur. And around the issue of gunpowder weaponry. We've seen two videos, I think, with Dan at Fort Nelson, looking at an example of the type of cannon that would have been used at the siege. And one of the questions that has come up a few times is around the projectiles that the cannons would have fired. Now, we've seen in these videos how the cannons were made, or at least we've heard described how they were made. And the type of projectiles they would be firing would be stone cannonballs. Now I personally don't know what type of stone they would be made from. I have had a look, I can't seem to find too much about it, so maybe one of you can have a look to see if you can find what sort of stone they would be made from. I presume granite or something pretty tough. But they would all be custom made for the cannons. I don't believe there was any type of standardisation at this time, so all the balls are going to be custom made for each weapon. Some of you have also commented on the fact that the cannons had a reasonably short range. Well, that's partly, I think, to do with the fact that the gunpowder was not as high a grade as it would have been later in history, but also because of the fact that these balls, which were being custom made, as I said, and because they were made from stone, would not fit particularly snugly into the cannons. They'd be put into the cannon, and when the gunpowder was ignited and when it fired, a lot of the force would escape around the edge of the ball, thus reducing the amount of force behind the ball, throwing it a shorter distance. I think they tried to get around this by stuffing straw into the cannon to reduce the amount of force that was wasted. But that may be one of the reasons why Nick Hall comments that the force and the distance of the ball was not as great as maybe expected. Some have also asked whether other types of weapons were used at the siege, and they certainly were by both forces. So we know that the French defenders had some artillery from the town's arsenal, but they also had catapults, ballistas and the like. Henry V also took across other siege machines as well as these pieces of artillery. The Religio, which is a chronicle, which I think is detailed in the course, tells us that Henry took across machines of tremendous size which held enormous stone balls at the walls. So yeah, there was other types of siege weaponry being employed as well as the cannon. We've looked a little bit at how the cannons were used and where they were positioned, and the specific and special embrasures were built for them using tree trunks and various other materials to provide protection for the English cannons from the French defenders of the town, who, as we know, put up very stiff resistance. In fact, they never surrendered because the English attacked the town itself. The English never make a significant breach in the walls. They never they never get into the town. Harfleur is forced to surrender because it's starved into submission. So maybe we should remember this when we're considering, as we have in the course, what impact on the siege the artillery had. So the English do not storm the city, they're not able to. So maybe artillery is having maybe more of a psychological impact, but its actual physical impact is more limited. After the siege of Harfleur, what happens to the guns? Well, some of them remain at Harfleur to be used in its defence, but the bigger pieces are shipped back to Calais. Actually, the Duke of Clarence, on his way back to England because he falls sick at the siege, returns to Calais drops off some of the big cannons on his way back to England. So after the siege then, the army marches through Normandy, as we've seen, to Calais, and we've seen the route that they take. I think they were probably spread out into a number of bunches, possibly into the 3 battles that we know they were divided up into, because if the army was in one large group, it would take a long time to move. So we should imagine the army moving across a reasonably wide front through Normandy until it gets to the Somme, where of course it finds its way blocked. The French control the opposite bank of the river and have blocked the bridges and crossings across the river. So Henry is forced to take quite a long detour, as we've seen, southwards. He manages to eventually cross, and I'm sure many of the names of places that we've seen are probably familiar to you from the First and Second World Wars and many other wars as well. So by the time they arrived near the village of Agincourt, the French are blocking their path, and then we have the Battle of Agincourt, which we've seen the reconstruction of, and we've heard Anne's commentary about the various movements of the troops and their formations. One thing that a few people have mentioned, and it's highly understandable, is the debate around the number of arrows and the use of the archers at the battle, and there really is no answer to this. We saw in the reconstruction that maybe the archers were on the flanks with some in front of the men-at-arms as well, and presumably they would have moved at the last moment as the French closed on their position. When would they have loosed their arrows is another big question. As we'll see in the films next week in the course, they're portrayed as loosing a huge arrow storm, a huge cloud of arrows that flies over onto the French. But maybe this wasn't how it happened. We know from what we've heard from Tom Richardson earlier in the course that arrows were given in bundles, in sheaves of 24, and each archer normally had 2 sheaves for the campaign, so 48 arrows. Now, whether they were resupplied on the campaign is not really known very not very specifically known. So we should probably imagine them turning up each with a maximum of 48 arrows. If there's a maximum of about 9,000 archers, which there's probably a few less from the march, that gives us just under 400,000 arrows, collectively. Collectively 400,000 arrows. So would they have loosed them all as the French advanced towards them, or would they have held them back until the French got closer? My opinion would be that they probably held them back until the French got closer and loosed them as the French were nearer, thus improving the chances of hitting somebody and the force that was behind that arrow as well. And as I say, there's no clear answer on this, so you're more than welcome. Please do tell me what you think about it as well. How do you think the arrows were used at the battle? Also, some of you have mentioned about leadership at the battle and what role the leadership of Henry V played in the victory that the English secured at Agincourt, and indeed why the French were not victorious. Was that partly because, or wholly because, of insufficient or muddled or confused or not clear leadership on their part? The king wasn't there, of course, nor was the Dauphin, so leadership passed mainly to the Duke of Orleans and various other key leading lords. I think we should possibly consider, when considering the issue of leadership, exactly what role it would have played in the heart of the battle. So we know that Henry V was presumably active within the battle. In fact, he may have been knocked off of his horse at some stage, like the Duke of Gloucester. But what role would his being in the melee actually have had? With the soldiers around him, of course, that would have been a boost possibly to their morale, but to the soldiers further out, I mean, there's quite a lot of soldiers engaged in this battle. Would his presence there really have made much difference? And what role would he actually have played in the battle? Now, and as Anne says in the video, that the orders were probably relayed by trumpet calls and the like. Would these have been audible in the heat of battle? Would orders have been given by the king in the heat of battle? It's something we don't really know about. We're not really told what the king does in the heat of the battle, or what the other commanders do in the heat of the battle as well. So maybe again that's something to consider, exactly what was his leadership at the moment of the battle, not so much in the preparation for it, but at that actual moment when the two forces come together. And then the aftermath of the battle then, we've looked at the killing of the prisoners, whether that was justified or not. I'm not going to get into that right now. But really the sort of overall aftermath of the battle is that it cements Henry's hold on the crown, on the throne of England. He's able to return to England a victor, restarted the 100 Years' War. He is victorious in the battle. He hasn't really conquered a whole lot of France. He's gained one small city at the mouth of the Seine, importantly at the mouth of the Seine, but it's not a huge, great conquest. And indeed, of course, the conquest follows on afterwards. So it is a success for Henry V in that it allows him to launch the subsequent conquest of Normandy and silence those who opposed him, which we saw last week at the Southampton plot. It also re-energised possibly England's military community. We know that many of those, or a large number of those who fought at the Battle of Agincourt, can be shown to have gone on and participated in subsequent military campaigns, and some went on to have very, very long careers in Normandy. Some of those who served under the Duke of Clarence can be shown to have been involved in the conquest and administration of Normandy right up until the English are eventually kicked back out of Normandy by the French. So some people during their lifetime will have seen and participated in the Agincourt campaign and seen the conquest and then the subsequent withdrawal of British forces as well from Normandy. So next week then on the course we move to looking at the interpretation of the battle immediately afterwards, and also in subsequent literature in Shakespeare's play and then the two films as well. So do please keep putting your comments onto the lessons, do debate these issues, do keep writing your questions. I'll try and answer as many as I can. And I will just mention again that you can purchase an upgrade on Futurelearn website on the course, which will allow you to access the course forever after it finishes in 2 weeks' time. So please do keep enjoying the course and send your questions. Thank you.